Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, the best place to be wherever you are on your wealth journey right now. Today I want to tackle the question of should you rent out your main residence? Now this is a really good question, it's one that I get all the time, and it was inspired this week by Mars888, so shout out to them for inspiring this video. Now the question that they asked me this week was this: when can I rent out my residential property? I hear people say after 6 months or after a year. Also, how likely is it that a mortgage lender will allow you to rent? So this is a great question, and although I did reply to Mars888 at the time, I also thought it would make a fantastic video topic. Especially at the moment, because the pandemic, lockdown and economic uncertainty means that people's situations are changing very, very quickly right now, and sometimes it might be the only option you have other than to actually sell the property. This is also one of those topics where there's a lot of differing information out there. So, you know, is it 6 months, is it 12 months? How does that all work? Lots and lots of different conflicting things. So I thought I'd create this video to clear up all of the confusion. Now there are two parts to this video. First of all, I'm going to answer the question that Mars888 asked in the first place, and then I'm also going to tell you about 6 things that you need to know about before you rent out your main residence. So stick around for that because that's really important. Now first of all, I will say that I can talk about this firsthand because back in 2008, when the financial crash happened back then, this was exactly the situation that my husband and I found ourselves in. We were struggling to make ends meet, we were swimming in debt at the time, and the only way we could work out that we could make things work for us financially was to rent out our main residence and move into rented accommodation ourselves. And financially, that may well be the situation that you're finding yourselves in at the moment with all this pandemic stuff going on. So what do you need to do to rent your property out? Well, let's assume, like me, you have a residential mortgage. Now, when you get your mortgage offer on the property, the offer is like a contract between you and the mortgage lender. And you need to adhere to that contract. And some of the things in the contract will be things like you're going to live there yourself and not rent the property to a third party. If you do rent the property out without telling the lender and they subsequently find out, that can land you in hot water, with the worst case scenario being that the lender wants their entire mortgage repaid just like that. Plus, they may penalise you for breaking their terms and conditions, so I would definitely say don't go down that road if you can help it. So what do we do then? We have this residential mortgage. It probably has early repayment charges on it for about another year or 18 months or something, which means that if we relinquish that mortgage and get a new mortgage with a buy-to-let lender, we're going to have all those early repayment charges to pay. But if we stay as we are and rent the property out without the lender's permission, then we're going to find ourselves in hot water. So what we do in this situation is exactly what my husband and I did back in 2008. We ask permission. We ask permission of the existing lender. We say to them, our circumstances have changed, we need to rent out the property, is that okay? Now the formal name for this is a consent to let. A consent to let, because effectively you're asking the lender for their consent for you to let the property. Now usually there's an application process for this, and some of the questions that the lender might ask you during that application is in what way have your circumstances changed, and also if you are going to rent the property, what kind of rental income are you going to get? So it's always a good idea to find out what your rent is going to be before you have to apply, and it might be a good idea to talk to some letting agents about that and get a few quotes. Now what might your lender say when you ask them for a consent to let? Well, they might say yes, in which case happy days, you can then go on your merry way and rent the property out. And that's exactly what they said to my husband and I at the time, and we were able to go off, rent our new property, and then we got a rental income from the old property which also helped us to pay our rent. Your lender might, however, say no, and if they do say no, then I'm afraid your only option then is to refinance the property as a buy-to-let, if you don't intend to sell it. Now do remember that if you are going to change your mortgage over, you will A, probably need to pay those early repayment charges to your existing lender, B, have product fees, solicitors fees and valuation fees and so on to pay during the new application process, and C, most lenders will want you to have owned the property for at least 6 months before they will allow you to refinance the property. Now the 6-month thing is very much dependent on the lender, which is why I'm sure some of you may have heard 6 months, some of you may have heard 12 months, going back to our original question there. It will very much depend on the criteria of the lender that you're applying to. That's the new mortgage lender. And the best thing to do here is to speak to a good mortgage broker who will be able to assess all of your circumstances and find the right lender to meet your needs. This brings me on to the second part of the video, because there are 6 things that you might want to consider or investigate before you rent out your main residence, and I'm assuming here that you have little or no experience of being a landlord yet. Number 1 is that when you rent your main residence out, you may well be classed as an accidental landlord. An accidental landlord is someone who didn't buy the property with the aim originally of renting it out. So it might be that you've moved in with a partner and you have a spare house and you're going to have a go at renting it out. It might be that you've inherited a property from a deceased loved one. And again, you're not going to live there, you're going to have a go at renting it out. Now, professional landlords, by comparison, do a lot of due diligence before they buy a property to rent out. They may very well have educated themselves about how to be a professional property investor, and they may well have an accreditation as well. They usually know all the ins and outs of the market, and they have a network of other like-minded landlords that they associate with so that they can bounce ideas off them and get advice. Accidental landlords haven't done any of that, and effectively they're having a punt on renting their property out. Now, the government aren't keen on accidental landlords because A, they don't necessarily know what they're doing and they may well put their tenants at risk, and I'll explain about that a little bit later. And B, the majority of accidental landlords fail to declare their rental income to HMRC, and that obviously makes HMRC really cranky. So the number 2 thing you need to be aware of here is to make sure that you do declare your tax. It's very easy to do all of that online. Go to the .gov website and the self-assessment part, and if you click yes when it says do you earn income from land and property, it will send you a copy of your land and property pages that you can download and fill in. But you definitely want to be declaring your income tax. Number 3, because you may be classed as an accidental landlord, it may well be harder for you to get a buy-to-let mortgage. And I say may here because once again it is lender dependent, very much dependent on whichever lender you go to, and all lenders are different. As an accidental landlord, a lot of lenders will assume that you have done no due diligence about finding tenants, about the property market, about the rental market as a whole. And because of that, some lenders will want to make sure that you can afford both the mortgage on the existing property and the rent or the mortgage on the property that you're moving to, as well as being able to service all your current bills and commitments. And this is because the lender needs to cover its back. If you don't know the rental market in the area that your property is in, then it may well be that you can't find a tenant for ages, in which case you'll have a property with no tenant in it. And I'm afraid the mortgage will still need to be paid. And this is why the lender undertakes all these extra checks. This is called a consumer buy-to-let mortgage, and it differs from a business buy-to-let mortgage that professional property investors can get because it's widely thought that they know what they're doing and won't have a problem finding tenants. As I said, this is dependent on the lender, so the best thing you can do here is to get yourself a good mortgage broker that can search the whole of the market and find the best lender to suit your needs. Number 4. Bear in mind that you may well need a landlord licence in order to rent out your property. A landlord licence can be obtained from your local council. Now, if your property is in Wales or Scotland, it's compulsory to have a landlord licence regardless of the size of the property that you're renting out. So even if it's a tiny 1-bedroom flat, you'll still need a licence. In addition to that, there are certain parts of England that have also introduced what we call selective licensing. For the most part, it's inner cities and areas where there could potentially be a lot of slum landlords. So parts of Liverpool, for example, and certain boroughs of London would fit into this category. Make sure that you know whether your property is in one of these areas before you rent it, because if it is, you will need that licence and it might cost you a little bit of money to get one. If you don't have a landlord licence and your property is in a licensed area, then failure to do so may mean that you get a hefty fine from your local council. And I'm afraid to say that councils are not shy about handing out hefty fines because they do it as a deterrent to other landlords, so that other landlords can see what you've done and think, oh gosh, I'm not going to go down that road, thank you very much. So it's best to just make sure that all your T's are crossed and your I's are dotted. Speak to your local council if you're not sure. Number 5, there are now so many things that we need to think about as landlords these days. And there are lots of compulsory things that we have to have as landlords in order to rent out our property before we actually rent it out in the first place. So you'll want to make sure that you have all of these before going down that road. The obvious ones that spring to mind off the top of my head are as follows. Your Energy Performance Certificate, or EPC. Everybody needs to have one of those on their property. Your Gas Safety Certificate, assuming obviously that your property has a gas supply to it, you will need one of those. That's compulsory, you can't get away without having one, and they need to be renewed every single year. EICR, the Electrical Inspection Condition Report. This is a new check that only came in 2020, but it is now compulsory for all landlords to have one of those before we rent our properties out. Legionella assessment, again you want to make sure that that's all done and sorted, because the last thing you want is for your tenants to get Legionnaire's disease. You also need to be aware that you need to be a member of a tenancy deposit protection scheme if you're not letting your property through a letting agent. If you are letting through a letting agent, your letting agent should be part of a tenancy deposit scheme, so it's worth asking them which one they're part of. And all tenants need to be given a copy of their rental agreement and also something called a how to rent guide at the start of their tenancy and on renewal of their tenancy as well. Now this list is not exhaustive and you will need to pay for all these checks and certificates before you rent the property. The best recommendation I can give you here is to get yourself a good letting agent. Ask your letting agent about all the things that I've talked about in number 5, plus anything else that might be pertinent to the area or your property itself. If you are an accidental landlord or a first-time landlord, I highly recommend not doing this alone. Do find yourself a good letting agent, because I can pretty much guarantee that you'll forget something or you'll not be doing something in the right way. And I really don't want you getting your fingers burned. Now, I've used lots of letting agents all over the UK in the past, and I found that they really are worth their weight in gold. Certainly when it comes to disputes, sorting out if you need to evict somebody, or even just reminding me when my gas checks are due. The sixth thing to be aware of is that if you rent out your main home and you then go and buy another property, whether it's something to live in yourself or another buy-to-let property, then you'll be subject to paying an extra 3% stamp duty on the new property if you buy it in your own name and not through a company. Now, I did do a whole video on stamp duty, so if there's anything you're not sure about with regard to that, do check that video out. Now, please don't let anything that I've said to you today put you off from doing this. Financially, if this is the best thing for you to do right now, then go ahead and do it. But please make sure that it's the right thing to do first. Being a landlord nowadays is not for the faint-hearted, and I don't want you to go into this without having thought it through thoroughly. So many accidental or first-time landlords I've met say to me, well, how hard can it be? And as I've just explained, there is rather a lot to it now. And crucially, rather a lot of costs involved as well. And often people just don't think about all of those things. They don't take it into consideration and they get their fingers burned, and I really don't want that to be you. Certainly for myself and Ross, my husband, it was definitely the best thing we could have done back in 2008. And although I was a landlord long before we even bought that particular property, I'm happy to say that it did have a very happy outcome, because we sold that particular property in 2017, having benefited from 9 years worth of rental income from it, and we got a profit in our pocket of almost £100,000 after all taxes and everything. And just to let you know, we did change the mortgage from the residential to the buy-to-let as soon as we were able to, once the early repayment charges came off our initial residential mortgage. So I do hope you found this video useful, guys. Do give me a thumbs up just underneath this video if you have found it helpful, and drop me a comment below. Is there something that I've talked about today that you've not thought about at all? Do have a watch as well of these 2 videos up next, because they will help hopefully with your wealth journey. Do subscribe to the channel as well if you haven't done that yet. And thanks ever so much for watching this week, guys. Do stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.